Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. What's the difference between starving yourself and intermittent fasting? How can you lose fat without hunger? Why is eat less, exercise more terrible advice for most people? To help us navigate these questions and then some, returning to the show this week is award-winning investigative science writer, speaker, and best-selling author Gary Taubes. Gary studied applied physics at Harvard University, aerospace engineering at Stanford, and journalism at Columbia University. Fortunately for all of us, Gary has dedicated his work as of late to tearing down conventional nutritional theory with his research, lectures, and books, including a few titles you've probably heard of: Good Calories, Bad Calories, Why We Get Fat, The Case Against Sugar, and his new book that we'll be talking about today, The Case for Keto. If you're ready to finally ditch hunger and transform into a fat-burning machine, this is the show for you. But before we get there, here's a quick note that came in from Peter in the UK. He's a father of 5, and he says, "Hey, Abel, I've been following your podcast for some time now, and you and your guests are always great companions on runs, walks, or long drives. As a busy father and professional, with full lockdown in the UK once again, meaning homeschool is the new normal, I am powering through with your support. So thank you for your words, wisdom, and inspiration, which I am certain are helping me work towards my health and fitness goals. Best wishes, Peter. P.S. When are Wild Superfoods going to be available in the UK?" Hey, Peter, thank you so much for writing in. I just want to comment on this real quickly here. So much about whether we get stronger or weaker in the face of tough times is about who we're spending our time with. But some of that, especially now, can be virtual. Who are you spending, your virtual time with? What does your media diet look like? If you're constantly searching for threats, like I sometimes am guilty of this as well, I think we all are. If you're constantly looking for bad news and spending your time with all the, people who are saying that the apocalypse is coming and that this is the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity or what have you, you might be pretty bummed out. But if you spend your time really trying to work on yourself. Self-improvement is the thing that has always gotten me through tough times. I've been waking up, as many of you know, and playing music, practicing scales, just running up and down on guitar and piano for a couple hours, and I've been doing that for a while. And the times when I wake up and I work out, or I do some writing, or I do some art or music, I feel so much better than the times that I wake up and I just go straight to email or straight to the news or something like that. So be very conscious about who you're spending your virtual time with, and keep in mind we don't have to actually know each other or be anywhere close to in the same physical location. Of course, Peter, you're in the UK, so thank you for listening from over there. We do hope to get Wild Superfoods and some of our other physical products into other countries, but especially, with Brexit and all the things going down with supply chains, it's a little bit hairy right now, and we'll have to grow a little bit at Wild Superfoods in order to make that happen. But hopefully in the long term, we really do plan to make this happen, and we believe in what we do, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you, Peter, for writing in. If any of you are interested in getting in touch with me, you can always hit me up at abel@fatburningman.com. We've already had thousands of people join our wild challenges from all over the world, including Italy, Canada, the UK, of course, the US, many people here, including much more coming up. This is going to be a great year. With our new Wild Challenge app, you can track your daily nutrition, intermittent fasting, sleep, movement, meditation, mindset, and much more. It even hooks in with your smartwatch, the health app, and Fitbits out there. So if you'd like to hook in your techie gizmos, now we can do that. It's really quite incredible. So if you're into it, go and check out our new Wild Challenge over at fatburningman.com/app. And if you use the code BWILD50 when you join, you can join our next challenge for 50% off for a limited time. So go to fatburningman.com/app and use the code BWILD50, all, one word, when you join, and you can join in for half off. We'll see you there. All right, on to this show with Gary Taubes. We're talking about the differences between intermittent fasting and starving yourself, a simple strategy to shed fat without hunger, how much to color outside the lines when it comes to carbs, issues with eat less, exercise more dogma, how to flip the switch and start burning fat for fuel, and much more. Let's go hang out with Gary. Hey there, folks. Welcome back. Returning to the show today is award-winning investigative science writer, speaker, and best-selling author Gary Taubes. Gary studied applied physics at Harvard University, aerospace engineering at Stanford, and journalism at Columbia University. But fortunately for all of us, he's dedicated his work to tearing down conventional nutritional theory with his research, lectures, and books, including a few titles you've probably heard of at this point: Good Calories, Bad Calories, Why We Get Fat, The Case Against Sugar, and the newly released book, The Case for Keto. Gary, welcome back.
Abel, thanks for having me.
I remember the first time you were on the show, it was, I think I was holding a phone up to like a Zoom recorder on audio or something like that. It was like, for me, at least the very beginning days of podcasting. It's wonderful to see you here on video.
Hey, you know, it's 2021, whatever the year is.
Well, the virtual book tour, I would imagine, would drive you probably even more zany than the physical ones, right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
So I'd love to get started because reading your book, this one is almost, I read it through a different lens. As you go through and kind of read some of your story, it almost sounds like you're writing it as an overweight person who happens not to be overweight anymore, or an obese person who's no longer, that way. Maybe you could specify where you were coming from in that way.
Well, one of the things I wanted to get across in this book, is that intuitively, we all know there are two different types of people. There are people who stay lean effortlessly. We all know them. And there are people who, using 1950s diet terminology, fatten easily. And we know them, and often they're us. So people who struggle with their weight their whole lives are different than people who stay lean. And it's not just about how much they eat and exercise. That's sort of, on one level, intuitively obvious, except we have this theory of obesity that it's caused by intake versus expenditure, how much you eat and exercise. So in talking about this sort of obvious observation, it just seemed, am I going to refer to those people who fatten easily, and am I going to acknowledge that I used to be one of them? And it just seemed natural in this case to acknowledge that I was one of them. And at one point, I just have a footnote that says, look, for those people who wonder, do I belong in this category? I'm 6'2" tall. And I played football in college. I wasn't very good, but I played. And at my maximum weight, I've been 240 pounds, which is technically obese. And today I'm 210 pounds. I also said I was what we would have called chubby growing up. So it wasn't about how much I ate, at least not to me. I have a brother who was always exceedingly lean. We both ate as much food as humanly possible. I accumulated fat, he didn't. So in writing this book, I'm taking this perspective. There are those of us who fatten easily and those of us who don't. We've been getting diet advice for 50 or 100 years from those who don't, under the assumption that somehow they know better. And maybe the correct assumption is that they're just lucky. And those of us who fatten easily have had to find our own way to stop it because their advice doesn't work for us. Doing what they do doesn't work for us because we're different than them. And just talking about it, I started using, we and them, because we are we and them.
Yeah, and it seems like the camp of those who are putting on weight, have put on weight, or are carrying, extra weight, that camp, that group is bigger than it ever has been in almost every way. Like, you look at history a few generations back, one of the things I love about your work is how much you look into history and cover it and the ins and outs of it. And low carbing, dieting, vegan diets, none of this stuff is new. And it's important that people recognize that.
Well, I'm working on my next book now, which is going to be on diabetes. And it's fascinating because the discussions we're having are identical to discussions that were had 100 years ago. And if nothing else, the nutrition research community has failed us because when you're talking about the same thing for 100 years and you're doing the same experiments you did 100 years ago, then clearly you're not making progress and things have to change. But one of the questions I'm often asked is, why is keto so popular? And my answer is, well, because we have these explosions in obesity and diabetes. More of us are obese and overweight and diabetic than ever before in history. And for us, clearly the conventional wisdom fails us at some level. Now, the establishment medical researchers would say it fails us because we can't follow it. They don't want to fat shame. So they don't want to imply that there's something wrong with our willpower or, our character. But the ultimate message is the conventional thinking on obesity and the conventional advice fails because we don't follow it. And one way or the other, it fails. And so when it fails, you're going to look for other ways to lose weight. Now you turn into fad diet land, right? Now you're reading the books that are promoting something other than variations on eat less and exercise. And then eventually, maybe you get to vegan or vegetarian and it solves your problem and you don't go any further. But those of us who got to keto went past vegan and vegetarian because it didn't make a difference, or at least mostly plant didn't help. And then we, and you have a movement because more of us are fatter than ever. More of us need something like keto to solve the problem.
Yeah. And those cycles definitely come and go. It's interesting because it seems like was it around the time that Atkins was taking off that you originally experimented with low carb in your own life?
No, I'm not quite that old because that would have been 1960s for Atkins.
Well, there were a few cycles of that too, right? Where it's, I remember I was born in 1984 and there were a few books that came in. It was like echoes of Atkins for a while and things like that, right?
Well, there's been Atkins was echoes of other research.
And Banting, right? Yeah.
One of the, in the many ways that the medical establishment is used to dismiss this challenge to their authority, one that they prefer is it's a fad diet, and fad diets by definition is nothing we should take. And then the first manifestation of Atkins that you could find in the literature is 1825, and the most famous book ever written about food called The Physiology of Taste. It was written by a French gastronome named Jean-Antoine Briot-Savarin, and it's been in print since 1825, which not too many nonfiction books can say.
Yeah.
And then there's 1865, the first internationally best-selling diet book, technically a pamphlet, is another version of Atkins. By the late 19th century, European authorities throughout Europe have accepted that if you want to get obese people to slim down, you got to get them off carbohydrates, basically. And during this whole period, the standard of care for diabetes is what's called an animal diet, which is green vegetables boiled 3 times to get all the carbs out of it, plus animal-sourced foods like meat, fish, and fowl. That's fatty versions of them.
Yeah.
And then, our nutrition authorities come along in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the conventional wisdom is still carbs are fattening. If you don't want to be fat, don't eat them. And then Atkins comes along and adds the idea of restricting so much that you're in ketosis and you can now measure the ketones, and he recommends doing that with urine strips. And so he gets pilloried for basically taking the conventional wisdom and going one step further. And then the nutrition community comes along and the heart disease people, and they say, oh, no. We think saturated fat causes heart disease. And we should all eat low-fat diets. And if you're overweight and obese, you eat a low-fat diet, just eat less of it, so calorie restrict. And if you do that, the diet will work, and we could throw out all this carbohydrates are fattening dogma.
Yeah.
Which they do without a second thought. And by the mid-1980s, you've got this thing where, that what used to be the idea that carbohydrates are fattening and now have the carbohydrates as heart-healthy diet foods. And meanwhile, Atkins has been pilloried. He's been crucified for pushing high-fat, high-saturated fat diets on obese people who are at high risk of heart disease and for making a lot of money doing it. And so everyone else who came along with the same idea has to put a different spin on it. You can't just publish Atkins' book over and over again. The way I describe it in my book, The Case for Keto, I say that the conventional research establishment and the medical practitioners failed. They came up with the wrong hypothesis. They failed to help anyone struggling with obesity as we got more and more obese. And so they left it up to the physicians and the clinics to figure out, people like Atkins. And when they did figure it out and they came to a different answer, the medical establishment said it was a fad diet and it was quackery. And meanwhile, each succeeding physician has to distance himself from the quackery in the past. So you keep getting new versions of the same diet. So protein power, where you promote the protein content and don't acknowledge this is a high-fat diet. Right. Sugar busters, where you go after the sugar and you don't acknowledge you're promoting a high-fat diet. And then South Beach, where you make it more about fish and olive oil, so you could push the same physiological effects, but do it in a way that's politically correct. And you still have the same phenomenon today. Everyone who releases you can't just say what every other diet book has said. I can, because I'm a journalist. I can say Atkins was right, and Mike and Mary Dan Eads were right, and the Sugar Buster guys were right, and Agatston was right, and the paleo people are mostly right. And because I'm a journalist, I can do it. But if I'm a doctor, I have to add something new.
Yep.
So Malcolm Gladwell called it a patent claim.
Mm-hmm.
And now you've got yet another take. And then the establishment, which still has difficulty accepting that they were not only wrong, or it was not only wrong since 1930, it was tragically, horribly wrong. Most people would have trouble accepting that. They still have to paint this as quackery and fad diet. So what they do is they focus on how every diet book is subtly different. And instead of just saying, look, all these are variations on carb-restricted high-fat diets. And when people who suffer from obesity and diabetes eat carb-restricted high-fat diets, they tend to get healthy, because the problem is the carbohydrate content in their diet, not the fat. So,
yeah, and when you look at the amount of people who are having trouble with carbs these days, it seems like, as much as you want to put your blinders on, it's an extremely big problem for people young and old. The amount of weight that people are carrying now, the amount of insulin resistance is startling, but also something that can be dealt with. You can adapt your lifestyle and start to reverse some of these giant problems that are manifesting earlier and earlier.
Yeah, and again, the problem is the way the medical establishment looks at it is they say, oh, this is a multifactorial complex problem. When you have so many people who are obese and so many people are diabetic, and we've been telling them what to do, right, for 50 years, eat less and exercise more.
Right.
And they're still obese and diabetic. Clearly, there are so many factors involved that nobody can fix this.
Yeah.
And you can understand if somebody can't fix it, we're not going to blame them again for lacking willpower or having insufficient strength of character. We're going to understand that it's too hard to fix, that there are too many factors involved. There's the environment and socioeconomic status, and there's, and you've got these maps of obesity that look like, 47 spiders have been building webs simultaneously, and none of them address the underlying physiology or metabolism at work that would drive someone to accumulate too much fat. You mentioned insulin resistance, and if you're insulin resistant, you're going to have elevated levels of insulin throughout the day and the evening. And if you have elevated levels of insulin, you're going to be storing fat the whole time your insulin is elevated. And again, the diet book terminology, they would say you're in fat storage mode, like you're the fat burning man. These are the fat storing people. And what you want to be is a fat burner, which you just do, because then get rather than carry around 30 or 50 or 100 pounds of excess fat, you want to be able to mobilize that fat and burn it for fuel. One of the arguments I've made in my book is if you just think about this as a fat trapping disorder, rather than an energy balance problem or an eating and exercise problem or anything else, it's like some people trap too much fat in their fat cells. And the question is, how do you get fat out of your fat cells? And we've known how to do that, empirically for 150 years, and the biology of doing that since the 1960s. And what you have to do is lower insulin levels. And if you do that, which don't eat carbs, replace them with fat, your fat tissue will mobilize the fat it's stored, and your lean tissue will burn it for fuel. It's that simple.
So eating less and exercising more, that advice, when you compare two people who are approaching this, like a protein sparing modified fast you bring up in your work, someone doing that compared to someone who's just eating less and exercising more might have to deal with what was it, semi-starvation neurosis, and then they usually regain the weight anyway. So maybe you can just cover that a little bit.
Okay, so one of the things I'm hammering on in this new book, The Case for Keto, is how little thinking goes into the conventional wisdom on obesity. Okay, so the idea is it's caused by eating too much, and the way to cure it is to eat less, right? And there are textbooks on obesity that say diets work when they get people to eat less. They don't say diets work when they get people to mobilize more fat than they store and oxidize that fat. They say they work when they eat less, and then the assumption is if they eat less, everything else will follow, which is completely, even they would acknowledge, isn't necessarily true. So one of the things, assumptions is if you eat less, the result will be unequivocal lessening of fat in your fat tissue without any complications. So if we were prescribing a pill, we would talk about the risks and benefits, and the benefits would be this pill will reduce your fat accumulation. The risks might be maybe you'll turn green or you'll die of some horrible complication, but these are rare side effects. And, if it was an advertisement on TV, there'd be a minute of somebody speaking real fast going through all the possible side effects. In this case, you ask the question, what's the side effect of eating less? And one of the most famous studies in the entire history of nutrition science looked at this. And it was Ansel Keys' study in the early 1940s of conscientious objectors, in which he put them on 1,600 calorie a day diets that would be considered sort of ideal healthy diets today. They were green vegetables, tubers like potatoes or turnips, and, a little bit of meat, lean meat, because this was a diet that they expected to find people surviving on in Eastern Europe when World War II came to an end and Europe was liberated and they had to understand famine. So this study is known as Key's famous starvation study because even 1,600 calories was considered a starvation diet. And the patients who went on at these subjects, they were mostly lean, certainly by our standards today, but a few of them were overweight, and one of them maybe was venturing towards obesity. So they didn't have a lot of weight to lose. And they didn't lose a lot of weight. They lost a couple pounds a week in the first, I think, 6 or 10 weeks, and then it slowed down to like a quarter pound a week. And the Keys and his colleagues wrote 2 volumes, about 1,500 pages worth of 1,300 pages worth of reports on this and other episodes of starvation and famine in human history. And the key is that the reason it was called a starvation study is because these people were quite literally starving. They felt like they were starving. They thought about food all the time. They chewed 40 pieces of gum a day. They dreamt about food at night. They couldn't be allowed outside of the study confines, except they had to institute a buddy system because they couldn't be trusted not to cheat if they were allowed to go into town. 2 of them, who the phrase Keys and his colleague used was, I think, starvation psychosis, were so desperate to get out of the study that they tried to mutilate themselves. One of them successfully cut off a couple of his fingers with an axe, hoping to get out of the study. The rest of them just suffered from what they called starvation neurosis, which is the thinking about food all the time. And then when the study was over and they were refeeding them, they realized they had to refeed them slowly because otherwise they'd eat so much so quickly they'd get sick. So they had to slowly allow them to eat more and more, but they still worked up often to like 10,000 calories a day. And at the end of the study, they had 50% more fat accumulated than when they started, which they called post-starvation obesity. And I said in the book, we've all been there.
Yeah.
We try to do this. You try to eat less. You're hungry all the time. And the question you have to ask is, why is it our lean friends can stay lean effortlessly without having to try to eat less? And we can only get close to being lean if we constantly deal with hunger. And what the message of Key's study was is that nobody could deal with hunger. Thin people can't deal with it. Obese people can't deal with it. So they're asking the wrong question. It's not, will obese people lose weight if they're starved, or semi-starved? The answer is yes, they will, but they'll be semi-starving all the time.
Yeah.
Why is it that for them to be a healthy weight, do they have to be semi-starved? And for them to maintain a healthy weight, do they have to be semi-starved with all the negative sequelae, that not just the hunger, but slowing of metabolism, hair falling out, nails getting brittle, loss of sex drive. There's all these sequelae to the caloric deficit. And lean people suffer it and obese people suffer it. So again, I'm just suggesting in this book, as I have in my previous books, that maybe people are asking the wrong questions.
Yeah. And so if you're trying to starve someone, oddly enough, intermittent fasting sounds like starving. But when you do these extended under eating, even if it's eating the same thing, you should be losing weight type of experiments, it's just not, our bodies don't work that way. Right?
Well, so you mentioned the protein sparing modified fast. That was developed at Harvard, MIT by George Blackburn and Bruce Bistrian in the 1970s, and it was developed based on like physiological principles, the same one ketogenic diet is, which is the hormone insulin drives fat accumulation, and carbohydrates drive insulin. So if you want to get people to lose weight, you get the carbohydrates out of the diet. They didn't actually replace the carb calories with anything. So they fed their obese subjects and then patients 700 calorie a day diets of, lean meat, fish, and fowl with green vegetables. And so they were still getting about 50% of their calories from fat in the meat, fish, and fowl. And they said they lost weight effortlessly and they weren't hungry. And the way Bistrian phrased it to me, he said the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? That was, they're not hungry. You can put people on a 700 calorie diet. There was a pediatric endocrinologist at Duke, James Sidbury, who did this with kids. And he said the kids developed the diet for the same thinking, keep insulin low. And he was dealing with obese children in the 70s. And he said the mothers, when he told them to only feed these kids 600 calories a day, the mother said, that's crazy. They'll throw tantrums, they'll go crazy. But without stimulating insulin secretion, the kids were perfectly happy to live on 600 calories a day. And then Sidbury comments in the article, and he went on, by the way, to run the National Institute for Child Health, and I forget what it was called, Human Development. So major figure in the field, not a fringe quack. Just said, if I want to develop a diet for obesity, it's got to be a hypoinsulinemic diet. It's got to minimize insulin secretion. And when you do that, people aren't hungry. And you ask, why wouldn't they be hungry? And the answer is, well, if insulin's minimized, they're mobilizing fat from their fat tissue and burning it for fuel. And that's fat that they wouldn't burn if they were weight stable. So if you're losing 2 pounds of weight a week and you've minimized your insulin secretion, that's 2 pounds of fat that you're burning every week for fuel. It's like 2 pounds of fat that you're eating. It's a stick of butter a day that you're eating that you're not eating if you're weight stable. So maybe that's why you're not hungry, because your body is well fed. It's being fueled by your fat stores, which is what's supposed to happen. And the same thing in intermittent fasting, because you're not eating at all. And this was observed in fasts going back to the 1960s. People who fast, who don't eat anything, after a short period are not particularly hungry. And George Cahill, who did these fasting studies at Harvard, cited this. And the idea is because their body adjusts quickly to the absence of food. And because insulin is very low, they mobilize. First, they start to burn their protein for a short period of time, but then they mobilize fat, generate ketones from the liver. The ketones fuel the brain. The fat fuels the rest of the body and preserves the protein. And they're not hungry because they have plenty of fuel to burn. It's just the researchers call endogenous fuel, internal fuel rather than exogenous, which is the stuff we eat. So biologically, it all makes sense. The intermittent fast, you skip a day, you go 18 hours without eating, you restrict your food intake to between like 1 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 in the evening. You're extending the period of time that your insulin's staying low. and you're extending the period of time that you're mobilizing fat and burning it for fuel. And as long as you have any fat on board, and all normal individuals have enough fat to fuel their bodies for a month, even, the winners of marathons have enough fat, the 120-pound Kenyans who fly over the hills for 26 miles, they have enough fat on board to fuel their bodies for a week at least.
Yeah.
So you just say your body's perfectly happy to run on fat. It's not surprising that you're not hungry.
So why is it still so freaky to so many people to even attempt a venture down that road,
Wait, to attempt
going down that road of eating fewer carbs or trying to fill up on protein instead or something like that? Why is it so freaky for people?
Well, first of all, as we said, if you're insulin resistant, you're burning carbs for fuel. Carbohydrates are your fuel. It's not, they're your food. Fat and protein are relevant. Mm-hmm. If your insulin's elevated, carbohydrates are your food. So now you're being told not to eat the food, the fuel. It's like if I told you that, look, I want you to drive from, to Denver, but you can't use gasoline.
Right.
Okay. And you're going to be hesitant to even get in the car. You might say, well, geez, I got, the gallon in the tank. That'll get me 1/10 of the way, but it's not going to get me there. And he's telling me I'm not allowed to fill up. That's how your body's thinking. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's one of the reasons. Then the question is, I could tell you not to eat carbs and just continue eating whatever else you're eating, but now carbs are 50% of your diet, 60% of the typical American diet. So now you're going to be living on 40% of the calories you used to be, even if you're willing to embrace that. That's effectively what the protein-sparing modified fast was. The question is, what are you going to do when you get down to a healthy weight? So the traditional way to think about it is, then I'll go back to eating carbs.
Right.
And then you go back to carbs being fattening and you get fat again. The other way to think about it is I can't stay at 40% of my calories. That's not going to work. So now and nobody thinks it through that far, including the nutritionists and the dietitians. Bistrian and Blackburn did, which is why they got out of the field. Well, because they were afraid of high-fat diets. They thought the nutritionists knew what they were talking about, and saturated fat would cause heart disease. So the high-fat version of what they were prescribing, the version where you replace the calories of carbs with calories of fat, is Atkins. Yeah. And they thought Atkins would kill people. So they couldn't do that. So instead, they just got out of the field. Basically, ultimately, you're left with this idea, and this is what diabetics did pre-insulin. You get all your calories from fat. Not all. You replace the carb calories with fat calories, and we've been conditioned to think that dietary fat's going to kill us. All the messages we get, even the mostly plant message or the plant-based messages, based almost fundamentally on the idea that the animal fats are going to kill us, give us heart disease.
Yeah.
I read an article today about the keto diet, and I think it was Insider magazine, and they talked about the diet, quoting dietitians saying, look, any diet that says you can eat bacon as a snack is a bad diet, end of story. So all these ways we're conditioned. It's a high salt diet because you want to replenish the fluids you're losing. So you're taught when eating keto to heavily salt your food, if not drink, salt-rich broths. Like I said, high saturated fat, people are told it's unsustainable. Like if you had told a cigarette smoker, cigarettes cause lung cancer, but I don't want you to quit because 95% of the people who try to quit fail. Quitting smoking is unsustainable. Therefore, I'm not going to tell you to quit.
Right.
Like I said, there's crazy logic in this field. So I think, there's just, and it's supposedly a fad diet. So even if you could imagine going the rest of your life without eating a donut or drinking a decent beer or eating a bagel or having pasta ever again, it's a fad diet. It's got people going to make fun of you. And people do. I talk to people who, you lose 150 pounds on the diet. The woman I quote in the book, Rochelle Pletz, Ploetz, she had an Instagram post where she said, went on keto. I lost, let's see, she went from something like 370 down to 230. And I'd lost 140 pounds, and suddenly my friends are saying, I'm worried about the bacon you're eating.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, you weren't worried about me when I weighed 370 pounds? Now that I only weigh 230, you're afraid I'm killing myself by eating bacon?
Yeah.
It's sort of, but this is the way we've been conditioned to think. I've been doing this for 20 years. I'm still waiting for the bacon to give me colon cancer or whatever it was that my mother said eating bacon would cause when I was like 20.
Well, the amount that people think they know about this is so off base, right? Like you quote in your book often, the doctors don't know much about nutrition. Science does have a lot of studies, but the amount of people who are out there saying bacon will kill you, you know, what about colon cancer? Aren't you worried about your heart, cholesterol, all these things? People think that they know all of this, but if you do follow the science, you don't quite get to their conclusions.
Well, that's the thing. If you ask them to give you references, well, actually, I'll take that back, because one of the problems, and I discuss this at the end of the epilogue of Good Calories, Bad Calories, you've got, in effect, in the nutrition obesity research field, what the physicists would have called a pathological science. This is a science of things that aren't so. So it's basically a science where you just get the wrong answer, where people don't rigorously, critically test their own hypotheses, where they don't actually, in this case, they don't even believe anymore, a lot of them, in the concept of experiment and test, where they'll do one study and say, oh, look, we've proven everything. I mean, the science itself is terrible. And the funding in the science is such that a researcher might get what's called an R01 grant, which is $500,000 a year for 5 years, where they've got to take their salary and pay their lab techs and then do some kind of clinical trial. So you have the funding such that they generate these completely meaningless studies, and you have to keep publishing and keep publishing because, remember, publish or perish. You've got to get funding, you've got to get tenure, you've got to support everyone. So it's as though modern nutrition science and obesity science has become what I think of as a noise generating machine. There's a newsletter sent out by the office of the dean of the University of Indiana School of Public Health. He was doing this for decades, and it's obesity and energy related studies published that week, and it typically averages about 150 studies a week. If you Google, go to PubMed.gov, the National Library of Medicine website, and put in obesity as a keyword, you'll get, I don't know, I'm guessing 1 million results. So out of that, you can pick and choose anything you want. People accuse me of doing the same thing. You could say, well, this study tells me this and that study tells me that. Most of them confirm the conventional wisdom, because the way you get funding is by generating results that confirm what you already believe. If you generate science that gets a different result, people are going to be skeptical and they're going to be unwilling to fund you further, because the implication is you already got it wrong. Why should we give you more money? So it's sort of, it's a mess. I mean, it's just a mess. And the people who, believe that they understand, or whether they're dietitians or nutritionists or me or you or physical trainers, God help us, they're convinced they're right. They've been telling everybody what to do. And particularly if they're lean and healthy, then they know that what they do works, right? Okay, so they can tell everybody else to do that, and it'll work for them too. So they're just very strong belief systems. And then we all get on Twitter, and on Twitter, the business of Twitter is people telling us what they believe, as though they're, and why you're an idiot if you believe differently.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think the pendulum will swing back? Because right now it's a very, it's like thinking deeply is almost impossible in an environment like this. Questioning, any sort of idea is also unpopular. How does the pendulum swing back? How do we get out of this?
I don't know. One thing that the internet did is it democratized the process of interpreting scientific research. So it used to be that you had to be an academic, you had to have access to a major science or medicine library. It was a small group of people. They were the gatekeepers on what truth was. And whatever they interpreted, that was what the rest of us had to believe. And then there were some journalists in between to sort of translate what they said for the popular, less intellectually endowed public. And the internet comes along, and suddenly nowadays you could download virtually any article ever published, and even for free through several Eastern European websites. Anyone can do it, and so everybody's got a theory now. It's a mess. I mean, it's interesting. I'm a huge fan of science, and I can get very pessimistic. I mean, in some fields, you can still have reliable knowledge because people can still do hypothesis and tests. So if the field is set up in such a way that you can actually test relatively easily test your hypotheses, and other people can test your hypotheses, and meaningful hypotheses will be tested. But in the kind of fields like nutrition and obesity research, that's very hard, if not impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's very hard and very expensive to do. And what's happened is you have this degrading of the psyche of the research communities, where they say, because it's so impossible to do, we're going to assume now it's no longer necessary.
Right.
And we can believe our hypotheses. And then you get into kind of world where you have obesity and diabetes epidemics, and everybody says, well, we understand that they're just not following our advice.
Right.
That I don't know how to fix. It's not up to me to fix it, but I don't even know. I think a lot about what could be done to help mitigate this problem of noise generation and no meaningful theories being tested, and the adherence to the dogma and the conventional wisdom against all studies coming out to the contrary. I have ideas. I can't imagine them being embraced, and certainly nobody's listening to me these days.
Oh, come on.
Well, nobody that world. But if I could get funding, believe me, I would spend significant time. I've always thought, this is off base, I always thought there'd be sort of a scientific version of the Supreme Court, where you have judges, you have the jury is a jury of very smart scientists from a variety of fields, have proven that they're critical, rigorous thinkers, and then the people pushing different theories would be like defense and prosecuting attorneys presenting their cases.
I love that.
And at the end of the trial, the jury would decide whether or not one case or the other should be, funded, and what kind of clinical trials should be done to fund these hypotheses. And then they would move to the next trial, which might be an entirely different area of science.
Yeah.
You might have to get a slightly different jury. And but then this idea has been pushed in the past and never got so far. It's very easy to criticize it, to say, well, what about this? This is going to happen. I can see where this goes down the valve. And then nobody has to do anything, rather than try to listen to the criticisms and try to figure out how to make it work. It's always easy to say, I'm getting funding.
Yeah.
We don't need this. The diet world's a different situation. And here, the key thing to know is, you don't need a massive clinical trial, a massive experiment to tell you whether a ketogenic diet works for you, or a vegan diet, or a DASH diet, or a Mediterranean diet. If you have a symptom that bothers you, whether it's excess weight or poor blood sugar control or hypertension or acne or irritable bowel syndrome, or you're losing your hair, or your skin is turning green, you could try any one of these diets and see if it fixes it. And if it does, it doesn't matter what the clinical trials say. The clinical trials give you a probabilistic assessment of whether this will work better than that. But the ketogenic diet movement has been driven by people who, like I said, they were among the tens of millions who were getting fatter and more diabetic, who couldn't control their own weight, who experimented with different approaches, who found that this worked. And then what people like me and Nina Teicholz and hundreds of others have done is we have communicated, gotten people to understand that doing the experiment won't kill you.
Yeah.
That this is a healthy way to eat, that there's more clinical trials testing the risks and benefits of the ketogenic diet probably than any diet motto in history. Now, ideally, they would last for 10 years rather than 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
But over 1 or 2, they are consistent in telling us that this is a beneficial way to eat, that people get healthier. They don't get unhealthier, they get healthier. So now you could try it yourself. And because of that, people are, and you get more and more people eating this way, and then there's a demand for a supply of keto-friendly foods. So you get an industry supplying foods that people can eat and snack on, and even, meals delivered. And it gets easier and easier to do, easier and easier to functionally sustain. Because there's a greater and greater demand, because people they do the experiment. They say, I'm going to try. That's what I did. Let me try this and see what happens. I had a very smart guy, an economist at MIT, tell me 20 years ago that his collaborator, so he has a collaborator at Wharton Business School, and his collaborator's father lost 200 pounds on Atkins. And he did it. He's Asian American. He said, I lost 40 pounds basically just giving up white rice.
Wow.
If you're writing about dietary fat, you should try Atkins. So like I said, I had been gaining 2 pounds a year in my 30s from 1986 onward. So I thought I was exercising an hour a day. I lived in Venice Beach in California. That's what we do in Venice Beach. We exercise. I was eating a low-fat, mostly plant diet, and I was getting fatter. So I did it as an experiment, and the excess weight went away. It fixed the problem. Like you flip a switch, and I burnt the fat off. I stopped storing it, and I started burning it. So it's sort of, you can do this. You don't need a clinical trial to tell you whether it'll work for you. You don't need somebody else telling you it's unsustainable. Don't do it.
Right.
Because they don't know what it means to lose 50 pounds or 80 pounds, to go from being, a BMI of 40 to a BMI of 28, to be healthy for the first time in your life. They don't know what it means to weigh 300 pounds and, go from 170 at the end of high school to 300 at age 35, and then change what you eat, but not how much, and go back to 170 pounds. So they don't let them tell you what's sustainable or not.
So how much are you able to color outside of the lines when it comes to carbs, for example, or other foods that might not well serve you in the long term, but you still want to enjoy, or a proper beer, as you said?
Well, I've been doing it for so long now that I have a lot. First of all, I don't have, even though I at one point weighed 240 pounds, that was my max. So I'm 6'2", it's a BMI of around 32. I don't have a family history of obesity. I always put on weight easily, but I'm not worried about it. Now, after 20 years, I have an enormous amount of practice and understanding with how my body works and what it can tolerate and what it doesn't. So if I go out to dinner, like my wife and I, on our birthdays and anniversary, we go to a local Italian restaurant. She's a mostly vegetarian, and she'll save her pasta now for really good pasta.
Nice.
And this restaurant has really good pasta. And when we go there, I'll eat some of hers, and it'll piss her off, because after I have one bite, I want more bites. But I know that when I go back home, I'm not eating pasta. I'll make pasta for my kids, and I might have a bite when I do it because I like pasta, but I have it under control. And if my weight were to start going up, I would look at ways that I might be sliding down a slope and say, okay, let's, the pasta's, that bite of pasta you have every night when you make your kids dinner is not a good idea. Let's just stop that. And I'm confident that after 2 days, I won't miss it. So I allow myself, I feel best when I'm not eating any of that stuff, but I also know how my body works, and I can afford, it's like, and the flip side is, I often, when I think about restricting carbs, I think in addiction terms, as the physicians I interviewed for this book often do, typically do. So I interviewed 120 plus physicians for the case for keto. I used to be a smoker, and you don't quit smoking by smoking in moderation. And I tried for 20 years to smoke in moderation and failed.
Yeah.
You quit when you go cold turkey. And 20 years later, 24 years later, I still know that if I had a single cigarette, I'd be back to struggling with an addiction. My wife can smoke socially. There used to be a pack of Marlboro Lights in our house that, her back when people came over, she and her friends would go outside, they'd smoke a cigarette, and that was it. It was like a treat.
Yeah.
With me, I'm back to being addicted to smoking.
Right.
Some of us are like that with carbs, and some of us aren't. So a lot of this is about, and the reason I wrote the book is so people can understand how to think about it, how to approach the problem, not just how to eat and what to eat, but how to think about what to eat and then how to control it for themselves. So you don't want people off the get-go trying to moderate their carb intake to say, well, can I have potatoes once a week?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say no, because if you have potatoes once a week, you're going to be looking forward. Your life is going to be about managing your potato addiction.
Yeah, right. Right.
And we just want you to get over your potato addiction. So if you don't eat it, you won't think about it. It might take you 2 or 3 weeks till you shift over to burning fat, and then you'll stop caring that you don't eat potatoes. And maybe you'll go out with your friends and they'll order French fries and you'll struggle with it. And you might even have a few. I'd recommend not at first. But 10 years from now, if you've maintained a healthy weight and your friends order French fries, then by all means, have a few French fries because you'll know you can control it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now
you don't. I think that's how, maybe I'm just saying because this is how I've learned to think about it and deal with it. I don't miss the foods that I don't eat if I'm not sitting at a table with them, steam rising from them in front of me.
Yeah. And you're not going to put them in front of you.
And I'm not going to put them in front of me because I know what'll happen. I know, I can say the words, beignet is a French word for donut, and hot beignet is beignet chaud in French. And I don't claim to speaking French well anymore. I can start salivating just thinking about it, just saying the word.
I am a little bit, yeah. I'm thinking of New Orleans, having a little bit of chicory coffee.
if I'm in a situation where there are hot donuts around or even cold donuts, and people are eating them, I'm going to want to eat them.
Yeah.
Despite everything. I'm lucky that I get to work at home. It's easier for me because I can completely control my environment. I'm not working in an office where my colleagues are bringing in cupcakes as a treat for the office and everyone else is eating cupcakes. And if I'm in that kind of environment, I got to find something that I can eat when they're eating the cupcakes that I like. And here's where like keto snacks, or keto cupcakes, I'm sure they exist.
They do. Oh, they do.
Because otherwise it's like I'm a reformed alcoholic in a bar where everyone's, toasting the Super Bowl victor or something. It's sort of, it's just going to be very hard to stop it. So part of learning how to think about it is learning how to recognize what's going to trigger your cravings and either staying out of those trigger situations or learning what you can substitute. And these are, again, they're all the same tricks that alcoholics learn if they want to give up alcohol, that smokers learn. It took me years to realize once I quit smoking that I cannot be in a bar with friends who are smoking.
Yeah.
And luckily this sort of coincided with the time that people made smoking illegal inside,
right,
indoors.
Yeah.
Had they not done that, I may have failed to quit. So.
Isn't that interesting? Now, one more thing that I would love for you to just cover. It sounds like information is more available than it used to be, doing research, for example. But I'm curious, is it harder to do research now? Is it easier? Because there must be a lot more sifting that you have to do now, it seems like.
Actually, it is sort of what I feared in terms of. So when I did Good Calories, Bad Calories, this was between 2002 and 2007. The internet made everything you could identify every major reference. And I had research young students working in Boston and New York and LA where I would send them emails with 50 references, and their job was to go to the medical school library, copy the 50, and ship them back to me. I could do more research than anyone in 5 years than anyone else would have taken anyone else a century or a lifetime had they tried to do it, literally.
Yeah.
But they'd be buried in the stacks of like the med school library at Harvard for 5 years, and then you'd move to another med school library. And,
wow.
Instead, I could recreate the history of the obesity research from conference proceedings, which I did. They publish books of the talks given, and after 5-10 years, the libraries don't want them anymore, so they get rid of them. They go to used bookstores, and I could basically buy every conference proceeding pre-1985 for like $7 and have it shipped to me. So then I could use that to put together the research history of the field chronologically. Now you can download everything.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's over. So now I'm doing a book on diabetes, and I'm overwhelmed. And I was afraid I'd be overwhelmed, and I'll spend a day, I'll read a new article that I downloaded, and then that article will have references to other articles that look interesting. And then I'll pull those other articles from the Eastern European websites where you can get them for free and probably infect your computer with God knows what,
right.
Spyware from the Soviet Union, but it is what it is. Anyway, then I'll complain to my wife, somebody sent me an article this morning. I was going to work on the book. I was going to do writing, but then I read that article, and that led me to these 2 articles, which led me to these 4 articles. And I spent the whole day reading articles and stuff I never even knew I had to do. Yes, that even existed yesterday. I've now eaten up a day of my life.
Right.
And I clearly have to get over it because I have to write the diabetes book if I want to pay for my kids' school next year. But it's a problem. And there's and the flip side is there's some tremendous material out there that you can, again, I've found some wonderful stuff for this diabetes book that I'm sitting around thinking I hope nobody else finds, because it took me a long time, and it's very obscure, and it's wonderfully poignant and right on point, and never in a million years. But again, it's my first book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, was 560 odd pages or something with only some of the literature available. So you clearly don't need it all.
Yeah.
And the trick of writing is to realize when you've got 90%, like you spend 6 months getting to 90%, you really want to spend another 6 months getting to 95% of saturation. Is it really going to make any difference? Because now you've wasted 6 months of it's a complex field.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I'm so happy that you've been able to put together so many works that are available to so many people, because to go through the amount of reading and sifting and tracking down the research that you've done is nowhere near as accessible as your book. So anyway, Gary, thank you so much for coming on the show. What is the best place to find you, your work, and what are you working on next?
Well, website is GaryTaubes.com. I don't keep it up as I should, but it's there. I tweet at Gary Taubes. I'm working on a book on diabetes, and hopefully after that I'll do one more obesity-related book on the history of obesity, science, and thinking of causality. This idea that how the energy balance thinking, the idea that obese people overeat, they take in more calories than they expend, and that's why they're obese, how that came about and how it infected and turned pathological all the science that came afterward. So that since the Second World War, researchers who think they're studying obesity are just studying eating behavior.
Right.
They're not even studying obesity anymore, and they just assume that somehow eating behavior is causal, and they don't realize that that's never been really tested and is a failed hypothesis. So I want to do that book, and then by that time I'll hopefully have gotten both kids through college, assuming they get off Fortnite long enough to go. And,
although that could be a more promising career in the future than whatever they're going to college for. Who knows at this point?
That's what they're arguing.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, they're only 12 and 15. I have to, I'm not sure how fulfilling ultimately it would be.
Yeah.
But that could be mine. But I'd be playing, if I had the hand-eye skills on the controllers, I'd be playing it with them. It's like getting fluent in some, very complex language.
It is.
When you're not fluent, you just can't
catch up. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And I figure I could get there, but it would take hours, right? Who wants to spend the time necessary? They do.
Yes.
It's their life, but I don't.
So, Gary, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. The name of the book is The Case for Keto. You can find it where books are sold. I highly encourage you to check it out. And Gary, I can't wait for your next book.
Okay. Thank you, Abel. It's been fun. Take care.
Hey, it's Abel one last time, and I just want to say thank you for listening to this episode of Fat Burning Man. Before you go, please smash that like button, hit subscribe, or even leave us a quick review. It helps so much more than you even realize. And if you can think of someone else who you care about, friend, family member, anyone else who might appreciate this free show, then please take a quick second just to share it with them. Word of mouth is really the way that we've grown this show over the years. We have more than, at this point, 4 awards in independent media, 50 million downloads. We couldn't do any of this without you, so we really appreciate it. If you'd like to get in touch with me, then please follow me under Abel James or Fat Burning Man on your social media platform of choice, and I'll do my best to get right back to you. Now, if you want to keep this show coming to you, you can do something really quickly here. My wife Allison and I, along with a very small team, depend on listeners like you to make this show happen week after week. To join our next challenge coaching group or get in touch with me one-on-one, visit fatburningman.com. We also make group coaching free with your subscribe and save orders from our family company, Wild Superfoods, which you can find at wildsuperfoods.com. And if you'd like, you can throw a few bucks into the tip jar as a one-time donation or become a contributing member of our group on Patreon. Just look up Abel James on Patreon and you can join in the fun for as little as a few bucks and get my international best-selling book and audiobook as a special thanks. You can also find that page at fatburningman.com/tipjar. Now, a quick disclaimer for all those legal eagles out there. The Fat Burning Man Show provides general information and discussions about health and related subjects. The information provided in this show or in any related materials are not intended and should not be construed as medical advice, nor is the information a substitute for professional medical expertise, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions and views expressed on this show have no relation to those of any academic, hospital, health practice, or other institution, including corporate overlords. We don't have any of those. If you or any other person has a medical concern, I wholeheartedly encourage you to consult with your healthcare provider. Whew, okay. Don't forget to join our newsletter over at fatburningman.com. When you sign up for our email, I'll even send you a wild quick start guide along with a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes, even Allison's famous chocolate cookies, as a special thanks for signing up. This is Abel James signing off. Thank you so much for listening and have a great week.